In what way Russian dictator will humiliate American president?
Sure. So I think, again, the number one, so some of it has already happened by simply the venue of this meeting. And the analogy that I often use is in a company, in a work setting, right? If the president of a company goes to a low-level employee like an intern and says, intern, you're going to meet with me right now in my office. The intern is never going to say, hey, I need to finish this spreadsheet first, right? That's not how that works. The president gets to dictate terms, the more powerful person in an interaction. And in the case of two countries, the more powerful person gets to dictate terms and conditions. And so simply by the fact that the White House's stance went from Putin will meet with Zelensky to get this meeting to Putin saying, no, I'm not going to meet with Zelensky, that signals to the international community, hey, Putin is the more powerful figure here. He's closer to the boss. And we've also seen already Putin, for example, presenting the Order of Lenin, a Russian military award, to Steve Witkoff, to pass along to actually a high-level U.S. intelligence official whose son was killed fighting in Russia. The son seems to have fallen into some sort of pro-Russian ideological extremist camp. But the idea, of course, is to sort of embarrass the U.S. to say, look, your own citizens are out here fighting on behalf of Russia. So this seems to be Putin's MO for these kind of interactions. And the more he can do it, the more even he can force the president, for example, he forced the U.S. president to leave the White House and meet him in Alaska, which is itself pretty embarrassing for, again, the U.S. president, the leader of the free world, the largest military and economy on earth, and he can't get the Russian president to meet him in D.C. That alone is pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, I hope that the American president is playing this, dirty game of Putin just to reach to some point, in favor of Ukraine. Paul, yesterday I opened CNN, and what I see that the U.S. ambassador to NATO, I guess, Matthew Whitaker, he said in response to President Zelensky that no big chunks or sections are going to be given that haven't been fought for or earned on the battlefield, referring to Ukraine's territorial concessions. This is not about calling it aggression, an attack on a peaceful country, or breaking international law, but about saying Russia gained this land by fighting, which is complete nonsense, but he is saying that. Why are we hearing this kind of language rhetoric now?
Sure. So what I think is the more generous policy interpretation. I mean, one, again, it's worth noting that in this administration, the president's the sole originator of policy. And so whatever he says that day is going to happen, the rest of the administration gets in line, right? We've seen people who sort of push back or take a different stance, end up fired pretty quickly. So it's a little bit of the only people left are people who are going to agree with him. But I think what you're also seeing perhaps from the more sophisticated diplomatic corps of the U.S. is that they may believe, if there's hope for a negotiated settlement, that they have to appear to be closer to a neutral broker than to having one side or another. Again, I think the U.S. has sort of tried this and it hasn't worked, but that I think when you see smarter diplomats say that sort of stuff, I believe that's the angle they're trying to take.
Yeah, I was reading some Wall Street Journal, I guess, and they were saying one of the ideas Putin and Trump will meet is like for the United States is to reset relationship with Putin. So it's not about Ukraine, which is not very optimistic. And, Russian commentators also say that the summit will not only be about Ukraine, but about the higher responsibility of two nuclear powers. And they're saying about something like bright future of U.S.-Russia cooperation.
Yeah, the U.S. has just a very robust track record of believing that these resets are possible. George George W. Bush famously hosted Putin at his ranch in Texas, where they talked, and he felt that he had achieved a strategic reset with Putin. Of course, Putin responded to that strategic reset by invading Georgia in 2008. So then the Obama administration came in and said, no, we're going to do a strategic reset. And that, of course, resulted in Putin annexing the Donbass and Crimea. And so and of course, President Trump came in after Obama, believing, again, in a strategic reset. And that probably was when Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine. The only person who hadn't sort of tried to do this reset and treat Putin like a neighbor who you just have a misunderstanding with, not sort of seeing he has a fundamentally incompatible worldview with the United States, was Joe Biden. And that is probably solely a function of the fact that he was in the room during the Obama administration and was able to see firsthand that Putin simply isn't a trustworthy actor, and that Putin's geopolitical objectives are to dominate Europe and to really impose a sort of Russian-centric rule on at least Central and possibly Western Europe.
Paul, what is upsetting me really so much, our European allies, it feels like there are a lot of adults in the room, but they're acting like kids. And, they always kind of are reacting too little too late. Don't you have that impression?
Yeah, so the Europeans, they have their hands tied, unfortunately, by really decades of underinvestment in their national security infrastructure. For context, when an earlier iteration of potential ceasefire peace deals were discussed, there was mention of European peacekeepers. But when each individual European country sort of got together, they realized they would be unable to field 20,000 peacekeepers on a sustained basis. That's across the entire European continent, right? 200 plus million people, and collectively an economy as large as China's, or nearly as large as China's. So that reflects just how poorly equipped the Europeans are to mount any kind of military resistance to, again, the Russian military, which, while Russia's economy is much smaller, they have raised a very large army. They have onshored a lot of their military manufacturing. They have a very robust partner in China. And so the Europeans, I think, are now turning around and saying, since the Cold War, we depended on the United States to provide us with top-tier level weapons, to provide us with essentially a backstop of national security issues, right? Any European national security threat, they could count on the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force to deal with that. And so I think the Europeans are realizing that they are now sort of confronting this large Russian threat to their east, of 600,000 plus armed soldiers with the most modern equipment, right? Something like 1 to 2 million drones a year is what they're producing now. And the Europeans realize that they can't help. There's not much help they have to give.